We'll introduce you and then you can take over.
Okay.
We'll keep the noise down so we can hear this.
Okay, Clifford, you want to give an introduction, please?
Hello, I don't know, where would I just stand so Mike can see me? I'm going to stand here so Mike can see me as well. Mike Dinn is one of the stalwarts of the Australian space tracking team. He was Deputy Station Manager during the moon landings. I believe from Apollo 13 on, he was the Station Manager at Honeysuckle Creek. Honeysuckle Creek was one of 3 tracking stations that did the lunar range tracking. There were many more that did close-in orbital tracking, but at lunar range only the 3: Goldstone, Madrid, Goldstone in California, Madrid, and Honeysuckle Creek here near Canberra. Tidbinbilla did the deep space stuff. Overview did the orbital stuff. Honeysuckle Creek did the moon range stuff. Mike was there. He knew all the equipment. He helped to run the teams that knew all the equipment and maintained everything. And he's here to talk to us tonight about mostly the ground tracking, ground communications infrastructure for the moon landings, and all the anecdotes and whatever questions you want to ask is on the ball. So
Leave them to the end.
Yeah,
leave them to the end. We have the ability to type questions in if they can't be heard
or
audibly.
you can use my phone.
We are recording this, so if anyone doesn't want their voice recorded, don't use it. Keep silent, and this will be on YouTube hopefully soon. Mike, we are honoured to have you. Thank you so much for being willing to put this presentation together for us tonight, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thanks, Clifford. Thank you. Just a little bit more on where I've come from. I was born in England and did an English electrical engineering degree, and worked for EMI and English Electric on aircraft electrics and avionics. Came out to Australia in 1960 and worked for 5 years on aircraft flight testing at RAAF Laverton near Melbourne as a civilian engineer. Only came out in a 3-year contract, mind you. No intention of staying whatsoever. I extended it to 5 years, and then we didn't know whether we were going to stay or not. We had 6 children by this stage, I might just say. Anyway, I applied for a job as the Deputy Station Director at Honeysuckle Creek, manned flight station. And at the interview, they said, if you don't get this, would you like a similar one at Tidbinbilla, which I'd never heard of? And I said, oh, yes. So that's what I was offered. So on the 14th of February, 1966, I drove up here to Canberra, which was Decimal Currency Day for anybody who was born by that stage. Moved into this suburb of Lyons, Canberra, where I still physically am, 50 odd years later. And so I spent 18 months at Tidbinbilla running, and in those days I was public service, the old called Department of Supply, and the government policy in those days was that the public servant would be the Deputy Station Director and would be physically run the operations. We had a contractor supplying the staff, which I think got up to about 130 or thereabouts at its peak. I just happened to be talking to Glenn Nagle at Tidbinbilla today. They only have 80 there today. So our main mission was Surveyor, first soft landing on the moon, which happened in May of 66, 2 or 3 months after I started there. Much to everybody's amazement, it was successful. And then I ran through a few more Surveyor missions. Then they said, would you like to move to Honeysuckle Creek in a similar role? And I said, well, heck yes, that's where I wanted to start with. So August 67 or thereabouts, I moved to Honeysuckle, Deputy Station Director, dropped in running the operations with zero training, I might say. But anyway, so there you are. That's my background. What I'm going to do now is do a presentation trying to stay away from the nuts and bolts, which you can all find at any time, anywhere on the internet. I'll give an overview of Apollo from a ground comms point of view, and I'm trying to put some anecdotes in which you're not going to hear from any other source. So let me go down this path now of screen sharing, and let's see if we can make all this work. There we go. See if this works. share. Is that coming through?
Yep.
Don?
Go to slideshow.
I've got to get up to my slideshow. I can't. I can't get my slideshow icon.
There it is.
Slideshow from beginning, but I'm not.
Yep.
Oh, here we go.
Yep, got
All
it.
right, that worked. No.
Yep.
I'm not on my first. Here we go. Okay.
It's all working. Looks great.
Looks great. Okay. Let me just get rid of a few things on my screen here. The word tracking, I put it in quotes. It's a phrase that's been used for years, misleading though, or it's a subset of what communication was all about in Apollo. But nevertheless, we call them tracking stations, and that's a colloquial term that we use. So I'll speak to the tracking in general. Clifford gave a great presentation, by the way, a few months ago, was it, Clifford? On the S-band system that was used, the 2.1 gigahertz world. I'll just briefly come on that. So I'll do an overview then of the missions that we supported, and trying to give you some try and give you some anecdotes associated with that. So let's see if this works. Righty, there's Honeysuckle Creek in its prime. Apollo 15, I think. Is that right, Col McKellar? Anyway, that's one of Col's
Apollo 15.
Taken by Hamish Lindsay. We had a technician at Honeysuckle called Hamish Lindsay, who did many jobs, technical jobs there. He took many photographs. He'd written a book, and he just passed away a month or two ago. A great loss to the few of us remaining vets around. So pointing at the moon, we actually had three antennas. This is Honeysuckle, by the way. HSK was the standard three-letter for the station. An XY antenna, as you can see, with an acquisition aid on the top there. That had about a 15-degree beam width at S-band, 26-meter dish. Then we had the wing station, or HSK-X, or Deep Space Station 42 at Tidbinbilla. So this was the original station at Tidbinbilla. It's an hour-angle declination mount, or equatorial mount, as you can see. And then we had the fairly famous, relatively famous place of Parkes. The 64-meter or 2 10-foot dish there, which, by the way, JPL, the American Deep Space Network mob, I won't say copied, but they certainly took it as a starting point for their 64-meter antenna. So those are the three antennas. Honeysuckle and Tidbinbilla were joined by a microwave link. And this, by the way, will give you a bit of a feel for the geography around Canberra. Here's the centre of Canberra, Parliament House about there. The Murrumbidgee River running south to north. A ridge running this side of the Murrumbidgee, which gave some radio shielding from Canberra. They were very concerned about shielding in the early days, but it never seemed to turn into anything significant. So the Tidbinbilla, so there's the Tidbinbilla station. Here's Honeysuckle, appreciably further south, and a third facility, Aurora Valley. The Aurora Valley one was concerned with Earth orbit spacecraft tracking. So we had a microwave link between Honeysuckle and Tidbinbilla via a passive repeater. So here's the tower with the microwave dish on it. Here's the passive repeater, and here's the receiving tower at Tidbinbilla with its dish. We actually had to move that dish when the big new antenna was built, because they plonked the antenna right in the line of sight to the passive reflector. We ran a fleet of Holdens, as you can see. This must have been taken in the 60s, I guess.
The ages.
that building there was the wing that was built onto the original deep space tracking facility, and that was meant and put on for Apollo. And I'm not going to talk anymore about it, but in addition, there was a very big tracking station at Carnarvon, Western Australia, a 9-meter dish, again XY mount, and there were several other 9-meter stations all around the world: Hawaii, Guam, Ascension Island, etc. They had a crucial role to play in the Earth orbit and near Earth phases. But the 3 stations that Cliff mentioned, Honeysuckle Creek, Madrid, and California, were the main ones for the lunar communications. So turning now the Honeysuckle station, we had an operations building, the antenna, 85-foot antenna here, and our own power station. All the equipment we ever operated, of course, was to American standards, 60 hertz, 115 volts. So we had numerous diesels in this power building. So I'll just go quickly over the parts of the station. The unified S-band area. This is the RAAF. This is the wiggly line area of the station, and we can come back to these if anybody's particularly interested. But there's the uplink to the CSM, Command Service Module, a 30 kilohertz voice subcarrier, 70 kilohertz the data subcarrier, and a digital ranging system.
Mike, we've lost your audio.
Oh,
No, it's back again.
Right.
all right. Your internet connection is unstable, it says. Somebody's
Oh,
internet.
30 seconds.
Well, yell again if it happens again. I didn't do anything here.
Yeah, will do.
All right.
The 2101.
2101 point something or other and 2108, I think.
2106 on the left.
2106. You can see them anyway, and the numbers don't especially matter. The downlink, now there's an interesting thing here, which the voice coming down on a 1250 subcarrier, telemetry on a 1024, a backup voice which was phase modulated directly onto the carrier that gave optimum carrier margin. But then there's this funny one called key, and Clifford mentioned it in his presentation, and that got me, and I might say a lot of other people around the world, thinking about. That was supposed to be Morse key, but it was never used. It was never exercised. It was never trained. But it was documented. It was a documented mode. And I've felt guilty these last 3 months since I first learned about this, because I'd never done any planning. We'd never done any exercising. I even wrote to a fellow called Ed Fundell at Houston. He was the main comms man on Apollo. And I said, hey, Ed, were we ever supposed to use this key system? And he came back and said, effectively, I don't know what you're talking about. So although it was a formal configuration, it was never used. But it was through you, Clifford, that got me thinking. Anyway, on the downlink, there was, we had an FM carrier for the command module. Oh, sorry. I haven't got the FM CSM here. And for the final missions, we had a thing called an LCRU, Lunar Comms Relay Unit. That was the little car that they drove around. It had its own about 1 meter dish, I think it was, and a lower gain antenna. But it all worked very well. And the TV camera was commanded from the ground, from Inco's console at Houston, Ed Fundell, who I might say, Ed I got to know quite well. They had a meeting a few months before Apollo 11 as to whether they would or would not carry television. And Chris Kraft, in his book, tells a story that one of the people against it was Ed Fundell. the fellow's in charge of all the comms. And it was a bit like me. Kennedy said, go to the moon and come back safely. Well, television really didn't help you to achieve either of those. Anyway, it went on very well. Ed Fendell got very skilled at driving the camera on the moon, and he ended up getting some European award as the TV Man of the Year or something for the Lunar TV. There you go, a little bit of an anecdote there. All right, anybody can study those and we can come back to them if anybody's that interested. This is the USB area. Receivers here, exciters, transmitter exciters here, the ranging. Oh, by the way, is my cursor coming through all right? Yeah. My mouse coming through all right there? These are the two ranging systems. We had dual systems, two transmitters going through a diplexer. We could transmit on both frequencies if we had to, although there were intermodulation problems which were never really solved. So in general, Honeysuckle Creek would transmit and track on one frequency, on one spacecraft, and Tidbinbilla would track the other. There was a secondary reason for that, mind you. The beam width of the 26-meter antenna was about 0.3 degrees to the 3 dB points, and the moon's about half a degree. So you really did need two antennas to do it properly. The man here driving the antenna, a sort of a supervisor of the group, and some racks to do with tracking data and timing with very precise time systems. And it worked, it all did its smarts on phase lock loops, transmitting on one frequency, doing a turnaround of 240 over 221, and then getting the Doppler out at with a very accurate resolution and accuracy. So that was the USB area. The output from there was fed into a telemetry area of decommutators. Now, all you young people would wonder what the hell all these knob switches and scopes are for. This was when electronics were electronics. I remember when I was showing people around Tidbinbilla at various times, you could tell the age of the equipment by how many knobs and switches it had on it. If it had a lot on it, it was 60s. If it had a few on it, it was 70s. If there was hardly any on it was 80s, and if it was none, it was the 90s. So if you ever want to determine what vintage electronics are, many multi-track recorders. We did record the television at 120 inches per second on some of these recorders, in addition to video recorders. We had video recorders as well. Now, Col McKellar, who was on with me, we've been trying to find, we being the collective we, these tapes, and unsuccessfully. They were degaussed, but the videotapes are still around, but there was hope of getting right back to the original TV tapes, and we never succeeded. Anyway, that's the telemetry area. Then there was a computer area, and this is when computers were proper computers. I think this was, Col might correct me here, I think this is a 32K memory pair of racks. You could literally pack all that into a laptop just about now. But as I say, this was proper computers, lots of little flashing lights and tapes that spun around and the like. This, by the way, illustrates the clocks. You may not be able to make that out. This log clock here is GET, ground elapsed time. That was the way all the missions were run. That's time from launch. However, of course, staffing and things that happen in your real life, this was an ordinary clock, except it was in GMT, Z time, Zulu time. And you wouldn't believe the number of times you get into these conversions between GMT, GET, and Australian Standard Time, Australian Summer Time. And not only time, but dates. I don't know how many of you in the radio amateur world have to tangle with that, but it was quite something. Then there was a comms area, lots and lots of teletypes that were going clackety-clack all day. printing all sorts of stuff out in NCR, non-carbon required paper. Several data lines and teletype lines came into the place. So we needed, as you can see, 4 people just to look after the comms side of the place. And then finally, this was my little area. That's me before I had a grey hair. That was my main offsider, John Saxon. We all smoked, of course, in those days, 2 packets a day and the like. I had displays of signal levels from, typically 8 receivers, 4 at Honeysuckle, 4 at Tidbinbilla, and 2 at Parks. And I had indicators of receivers in and out of lock, modulation types. And up here, this was my own design. This was which receivers were connected to which demodulators were connected to which decommutators, because we tried to have plan A, plan B, and plan C, so that if anything failed or played up, we could rapidly change the configuration. And I put a fair bit of Apollo success down to that. And I worry about the new Artemis program, that there was lots of alternates and backups and redundancies in Apollo. I get no hint of that in the latest programs. On down here are intercom buttons. We had numerous intercom loops around the station. I had a main one where I talked to the various supervisors. Each section had its own little loop. We had a line to Houston, a line to the Goddard Space Flight Center, who were responsible for the engineering of the tracking stations. And if necessary, either of us here could talk up to the spacecraft. We had a push to talk button that would go directly on the transmitter for command module or lunar module. As you can see, the worldwide comms was quite something. It's centered around the Goddard Space Flight Center in Washington or Maryland, using every type of long line, undersea cable, Intelsat, and Hawaii was a big terminal, but there were all sorts of alternate ways of getting to and from Houston, but they all generally went via Goddard. London was a center of communications as well. So the 3 main stations, as I say, was Madrid, Goldstone, which would be there, I suppose, thereabouts, and Canberra here. And then on the Australian sector, we tied up just about the whole of Australia when it came to communications. And PMG once told me that in the 1960s, NASA was PMG's biggest customer. And they actually put together a group of half a dozen people full-time in Sydney, Kent Street, to look after NASA communications. And when there was an Apollo mission on and we called for critical coverage, PMG would stop all work on any equipment at any facility that carried a NASA circuit through it. They were not allowed to do anything. And at that time, they were putting in things across the Nullarbor plain, and they'd all to stop work for the length of time of an Apollo mission. And by the by, Australia never charged NASA for the cost of all that, which probably should have done. Carnarvon, as I said, was a big station, and it had its own Intelsat ground station there. And that antenna is still in place at Carnarvon, the one that was used for comms. Those people who visit think that was the one that tracked the spacecraft. It didn't. It was there for the communications. In the early days, there was a deep space tracking station at Woomera. Marie, of course, was the main ground station for OTC, talking up till Intelsat. So ground comms was a big, big deal, not only for the tracking stations, but tracking aircraft and tracking ships. There were ships out in the Pacific, ships out in the Indian Ocean, aircraft flying out of Cairns and Darwin. And so the pure ground comm side of it was a lot of people. This is a modern picture all the comms in Australia were centered around Deakin, a suburb of Canberra. This whole ground floor here was devoted to NASA communications. The building is still there, but of course it's not used for that anymore. So moving right along, our very first mission was Apollo 7. That was the first manned, and I have to use the word manned because there were men, flight of the command module. And it was a baptism of, well, not quite fire for us, but we'd never been on a real live manned mission before at Honeysuckle. And we had to learn pretty quick. The volume of paper and procedures was unbelievable. However, the mission went perfectly from our point of view and perfectly from the checkout of this command module. So a success. This was about September 68, thereabouts. Just in passing, you remember I said it was an XY antenna? Any two-axis antenna is going to have a gimbal lock somewhere. And somebody in their wisdom decided that our antenna would be oriented in such a way that the gimbal lock was on the east and west horizons, which is the most stupid place to put it. For Carnarvon, they put the gimbal lock at the north and south, which made far more sense. So we had to cope with this darned XY interlock or lack of tracking. Anyway, this gives you a good idea of where you could track from an Earth point of view. Oh, the other thing that Houston had no idea about was we had a horizon mass. All their software just assumed we'd get a signal at 0 degrees elevation. And even out at Apollo 12 and 13, they still hadn't putting the horizon mass into their pointing predicts. When Apollo 7 was finishing, I was asked, do you think you could support a lunar mission by December? And I said, well, I suppose so. Yeah, I guess so. And that's what happened. The gutsy decision was taken to go around the moon in December 68. And we came into our own. Up till that point on Apollo 7, we'd been just one of the, whatever it was, 18 stations all around the world. But we came into our own here on Apollo 8. But I was pretty confident we could support. And this is where my 18 months on Surveyor helped in having this lunar trekking experience. So 8 was a pretty complete success. We received the Bible reading on Christmas Eve of 68. Oh, and I just realized about 3 months ago that for about 15 seconds, I held half of the world's longest communication record. On the way to out, we lost comms between Houston and the spacecraft. And they called me on another circuit, said, call the station, call the spacecraft, tell them we'll be with them momentarily. And so I pushed the buttons, talked up to Apollo 8. We have a recording of this, except you don't hear me. Anyway, I'll play it through, and at your leisure, you can look at this little bit where I've told, this is, by the way, is from what's called the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. Anyway, here we go. I'll see if I can play this. I hope it comes through. And I then went up with that inane comment, fine, and how's everything up there? Pretty good so far. So that was me talking to Apollo 8. I think they're about 2/3 of the way to the moon at the time. So for that length of time, I just realized quite recently that I must have had the world record. Then we had Apollo 9, where the lunar module was checked out in Earth orbit. Can you imagine climbing into that thing in Earth orbit? And they went about 100 miles away from each other, having great faith that they could dock again, join again, and crawl together. every Apollo mission, mind you, was gutsy. The steps were great, but there are a lot of people making a lot of intelligent decisions. So Apollo 9 was Earth orbit. We had fun trying to make the Tidbinbilla antenna track at Earth orbit speeds. It almost could do it, but not quite. But we supported that quite well. Apollo 10 did everything but land. Got down to about 10,000 feet, I think. John Young was on that flight. John Young visited us on the 25th anniversary of Apollo 11. So 10, again, another gutsy mission. And then 11. Again, I won't go into the detail. I'll just highlight something, an event here. This is where they're just getting ready to get out of the lunar module. And the TV did not come on as expected. And at one point, Armstrong effectively says, radio check, because he'd deployed the camera and there was no TV signal. And plainly, that phrase radio check was, what the hell do I do now? Simple code for that. I'm going to play this right through. You'll probably be able to follow about 10% of it. You'll hear me talking as ops. You'll hear someone else talking as calling himself Pam. You'll hear Bruce Window talking from Tidbinbilla. You'll hear the astronauts talking. You'll hear the Capcom talking, and you'll hear the PAO talking. I'll play it right through once and then maybe come back and try and explain it. Or maybe I'll leave it till question time if people really want to understand exactly what's going off here. So concentrate as much as you can here. But this gives you an illustration of what we had to cope with, like 6 or 8 conversations at the same time. Here we go. Where are we? Boom. The command module is just coming up to go behind the moon.
On the porch at 109 hours, 19 minutes, 16 seconds.
I hope it's coming through enough level.
Any more slides, bud? Okay. 25 minutes of PLS.
That's the command module just went behind the moon, LOS. Now, they should have had television at this point, but they didn't.
Yeah, Mike, the audio level's a bit low for that.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't quite know what to do.
A bit better.
There's a great deal of contrast in it, and currently it's upside down on our monitor, but we can make out a fair amount of detail.
So there's a lot of things happening all at the same time. But my biggest worry at that time was the intermittent EKGs from the astronaut. I wasn't bothered about the television. That was unimportant. Didn't matter if the television didn't work. It did matter if the astronauts' EKGs failed. as I say, we can come back to that sometime if and when anybody's interested enough. Oh, so this is where the television, how the television was handled. By the way, Col McKellar is the one who put all this together. Initially, the television was from Goldstone, California. And it should have been good because they had their big 10-foot dish tracking the lunar module at the time. However, the TV from Honeysuckle was better. And by the by, ignoring whatever you might have thought you saw on the movie The Dish, Parkes had not yet acquired. It was below the Parkes 30-degree elevation limit. So Parkes is not a player at this time. Anyway, you'll see the picture from Goldstone and then the picture from Honeysuckle.
At the foot of the ladder,
I don't know how to get louder.
are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 stations. We have to switch video to Honeysuckle.
So there's the Honeysuckle picture.
Very fine grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Now, man, it's very fine. Yeah, they'll step off the land now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for man.
So that's what went to the world. They come through a little later.
It was my toe, like powdered charcoal, size of my boot. Small fraction of an inch, maybe an inch, my boots and the tread particles. Yeah.
So that was the first step. Moving right along. This is the video converting hardware at Honeysuckle. The signal coming down was at 10 frames per second, and I think it was about 340 lines per frame. It was scan converted to the US standard of 525 lines in as crude a way as you could do it. The display had a video camera pointed at the CRT.
Oh my God.
And that's how the conversion occurred. Needless to say, a lot of the quality was lost right at that stage. And this is the main reason we wanted to try and track down those original tapes, which had the raw video recording on it, but we never did. However, this monitor up here, this one, displayed the video as it came in, as it came down. And this fella here, Ed von Renoir, did something which if I'd known I was doing, I'd have blown my top. But anyway, he brought his own Polaroid camera in and he took pictures of that monitor. And we've ended up with
There you go.
that picture.
Fantastic.
A complete bootleg, unauthorized, should never have happened picture. But one of the best ones there is of the first step, would you believe? So that's one picture off that monitor by Ed. There's another one, and there's a third one.
Oh, much better.
So, but that quality got unbelievably degraded through, not only through the scan conversion, but through all the microwave links that you can imagine went through just to get it into Canberra. We used up most of the outside broadcast hardware to get the signal from Honeysuckle via a relay station at Williamsdale into Red Hill, Canberra, and then into Sydney. It was a real big exercise. Trying to move along here. Just listen to this bit, if you can. Parkes has just acquired 6 minutes in. I don't. Listen to this carefully.
Oh, yeah.
So that's Parks. 6 minutes.
Mike, we've lost you.
Can you hear me, guys? We're not too sure what happened. Mike's just lost everything here. We're just trying to work out what's going on.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, we've lost Mike as well. He's disconnected. Can you get him to rejoin?
We're working on that, Greg. So if you can just, count sheep for a tick, and we'll be back with you.
Right.
We're just going to have to cut over from Honeysuckle to Parks.
You want to try Tidbinbilla first? It's closer.
Those sheep here, still none. Again, none.
Tim,
Yes?
Greg didn't mean say none to any of the sheep. He just meant count them in your head.
Exactly, none. I can still see none. None.
Like counting sheep in your sleep.
Yeah, none.
Yeah, no, yeah, on the Armstrong. They had planned the rest break. Yeah. He didn't want the rest break, so the timing on building up the shed.
So he was still on golf stuff. He just had a big signal. For some reason, they weren't getting a signal there.
I don't know, get it okay, stuff for them. Okay.
Contrast, that's a contrast one or something.
Yeah, it's gold sign.
We can see Dom's face, but we can't see Mike's.
We're still waiting on Mike.
But I mean, it shouldn't have mattered because the camera shouldn't have known that.
Still working on it. Mike's here.
Okay, he's connecting to audio.
Well, the camera was mounted upside down, but they knew that. And the reversing switch was actually on the display, the deflection coils had a simple changeover switch.
Okay, if you can hear me, here we go. Hi, can you hear me there?
Welcome back. Get
Okay.
Dom to mute.
Well, I'm on my iPad. It looks as if my computer fell over, and it took me ages to get it back. I didn't have that much more display really. I was going to talk about Apollo 13, where we had a big.
Mike, it's Colin here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Cole.
I've got the copy of your PowerPoint that you sent me ready to go. If I can share it, does that work?
Oh, yeah. Could someone? Would you?
Colin, just share it.
Yep.
Cole's going to share. I sent Cole a previous version. If you can give him screen sharing. Oh, well done.
Well done,
Oh,
Colin.
okay. All right, Colin. Well done. All right. Well, look, move on to Apollo 12. 12 was quite an achievement. They landed about a few hundred feet away from Surveyor 3. and recovered a part of it. They burnt the camera out minor, so we didn't have any TV. Okay, next one, Cole. 13 was a big deal for us. It really paid off having lots of people understanding their equipment, operating their equipment. And our biggest problem was that the lunar module rescue craft, which they had to fire up, transmitted on the same frequency as the third stage of the Saturn V, the so-called S4B. And we had to fight to get to cope with two signals on the same frequency. Show the next slide, Carl. It was in a thing called the instrument unit, the IU, top of the Saturn V. Anyway, there's reams been written on this. If anybody's interested, I can point them to specific references for it. Next call. Oh, I don't know why that's there. All right, next one. Oh, that was showing the LEM frequency. Apollo 14, do a click there and it should bring up 14 was routine. Alan Shepard had a two-wheeler. 15, I think 15 was the first one with the moon buggy. And by the by, it's just coming up. It's on the 50th anniversary right now. No, sorry, that was Apollo 15. Next. I don't know what that noise is. Apollo 16.
That's my friend. Can you believe that?
Apollo 16th is the 50th anniversary up right now. Okay, next one, Cole. Apollo 17 was of great interest to me. It was the last one. I myself was physically at JPL Pasadena in calendar year 1972, and the big new dish at Tidbinbilla was building Deep Space Station 43. And I decided, in conjunction with Tom Reed, who was the director of Tidbinbilla, it would be finished in sufficient time to support Apollo 17. Now, JPL weren't at all keen on this, but anyway, we did. We got it to support Apollo 17 in December of 72, even though it wasn't opened until April 73, as you can see from that plaque by Whitlam. There had been a bit of a tradition of having prime ministers open these tracking stations. Menzies opened Tidbinbilla, and what was the other fellow with honeysuckle, Cole? Oh.
Harold Holt.
Harold Holt opened honeysuckle. Oh, all right. Go on one slide, Cole. And then one more, please. Oh.
Next one.
The one that's got the two telegraph poles, the two wire pole.
Maybe
thing.
I'm using the wrong version. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Oh, well, never mind. It doesn't matter. I was just going to tell one final tale. All our communications from Honeysuckle to into Canberra were carried on two pieces of copper, strung along posts between the station and the little village called Tharwa. And every time I drove past there, I thought, this is not on. What happens if someone either intentionally or unintentionally breaks that piece of copper? The whole damn system relied on that. However, we had backup circuits that went through the microwave link to Tidbinbilla and then into Canberra. So I ran a simulation one time, pretending we'd lost that copper. And as you may or may not know in the comms world, I don't know if you've dealt with them, but the comm world tends to lend its loyalty to its colleagues. In other words, if you criticize or try and get the long line comm people to do something, their loyalty goes to the organization and not the customer. So the first problem is, first of all, to agree there is a problem. Second, because a standard phrase from our comm people usually was, it's all right leaving us. And And once it said that, you knew there was a problem, but they weren't admitting it. Anyway, after a great deal of faffing around, they did eventually restore the circuits, but it did what I wanted. It demonstrated that we didn't know what to do, who would, first of all, to diagnose the problem, secondly, how to fix it, and third, who the hell was going to call the shots to make it happen. So that was one of my little fun anecdotes. So there you go. That's more or less me.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks a lot for the presentation.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience at all? Okay.
My question is there's a large tower outside the town of Aurora, just north of Yass, and I was told it was paid for by NASA so that parks could talk to Honeysuckle Creek. Is that valid or invalid?
That's about 70% accurate. When I finished at Honeysuckle Creek, I spent 10 years out in our Department of Defence, then went back to Tidbinbilla in 1983, and my job was to coordinate the park's effort for the Voyager Uranus encounter. And that involved real-time telemetry arraying of the park's dish with the Tidbinbilla dish, which involved putting in a microwave link from Canberra to Parkes, of which the Burrower Tower was well, one of the most important parts. And so we, NASA, paid for that tower, and it got its signal from Black Mountain in Canberra, went through Burrower, and then to Mount Canobolis. So yes, that tower went in, not really for Honeysuckle, but for the Deep Space Voyager Uranus mission. But when I was driving past there a few years later, it had sprouted a magnitude of dishes. And Mr. Telstra by then was charging us, I don't know, 10,000 a year maintenance on that bloody tower and the equipment. So I got back, called my buddy in Sydney, said, "Hey, you appear to have put your stuff on my tower, but yet you're still charging me for the maintenance of that tower. How about we have a quid pro quo here?" I said, we won't charge you for putting your stuff on the tower if you don't charge us for the maintenance. So that's what happened. And that tower is still there. And if you can go and find it on Google Earth. So yes, your statement and your question was pretty accurate, fairly accurate.
So there was a question.
Mike, can I ask you? Oh, go on, Dom. I was going to say, Mike, would you tell us the story about pulling the two frequencies apart when you had two transponders on the same frequency?
Oh, well, yes, that was the Apollo 13 problem. As I said earlier on, phase lock loops were the smart part of both the communications and the navigation. And so the phase lock loop on board the spacecraft, which locked to the uplink, translated by a factor of 240 over 221. And if anybody knows where that factor comes from, I'd be interested to know. I gather it's used on aircraft transponders as well. And so if you tune the uplink one way, the downlink would shift. And that's basically what we tried to do. We tried to capture the lunar module and pull it to one side. And once that was pulled to one side, then capture the instrument unit, the IU, and pull it to the opposite direction. And that then separated the two received ground signals. And we did successfully do that, but it took a lot of attempts to do it. And then when we'd succeeded in doing all that, Mr. Houston comes up and says, "Oh, we want you to tune the uplinks, so-and-so, so-and-so." And I instantly knew that was going to take us back from where we'd bloody well come. And I had my USB supervisor screaming down the intercom, "Don't do that, it'll mess it up, don't do it." And Goldstone, the other tracking station, also came in shouting. Anyway, Mr. Houston said, "Do it." And this was one of my decisions in ops, which I don't know if I made the right decision, because I knew it was a wrong decision. Anyway, we did it and we screwed it all up and we had to start all over again. But I only learned about 6 months ago the reason that Houston had done this. It turned out their software for processing the Doppler shift assumed that the carrier was on its nominal value, even though the actual frequency of the VCO was sent out as part of the tracking data. They weren't set up to process it. And so they couldn't process the trajectory data when we're off center. Although the report then goes on to say something along the lines of, however, it was realized later that it could have been done, or words to that effect. In other words, a patch to software, that was a screw up by whoever wrote the tracking software at Houston, because the Deep Space Network, DSN, had always shipped the VCO, the transmit frequency, out as a field of the receive frequency, and they did the trajectory sums there. So, as I say, we coped, but it took a lot of effort and energy. It was about the only time the receiver operators really earned their money.
Any other questions? No? Right. Thank you very much, Mike. Very, very enjoyable.
Okay.
And thanks, Colin, for the assistance with the backup assistance with the presentation.
Yeah. I don't know. As I say, I think my computer just quit for some reason. All righty. Well, thanks. It got my little brain cells ticking along in a few areas. In particular, that Morse key thing, which thank God never happened. Well, when I prided myself that we had thought of every contingency and we had a plan for it, and wherever we could, we simulated it. We built our own simulation system, and we could simulate every aspect of a downlink and uplink there. Except we couldn't simulate an American voice as it stepped on a simulated lunar surface. But apart from that, we could do everything realistically. Anyway, okay, well, thank you all. I'll leave you be and find out what's happened to my computer.
Dom, whilst you're there as lecture coordinator, please book him in for something else.
Yeah.
I don't charge much.
And buy him a beer at least.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mike.